And welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host. It's a pleasure to have an old friend, Mike Aquilina, back on the program. Africa and the Early Church, the Almost Forgotten Roots of Catholic Christianity, is published by our friends at Emmaus Road. And also we'll talk a little bit about Fathers of the Faith, a series of 4 books that Mike has out as well, all available through our EWTN religious catalog, EWTNRC.com for all things Catholic. Hey, it's good to see you again.
That's great to be back, Doug.
That's right. That's right.
We've been doing this for so many years.
That's right. That's right. Absolutely. And we always invite you when you're back here on Jeanette quite often on program, obviously on with Father Mitch back in the last fall. So let's talk about Africa in the early church, the almost forgotten roots of Catholic Christianity. Now, they're not forgotten anymore because you wrote this book.
I hope that's true.
So we brought this forward. What made you decide to focus on this?
Well, because they're almost forgotten,
Okay.
and that's not a good thing. People forget where we've come from. And I think especially for Latin Christians, Western Christians, Roman Catholics, it's good for us to know where so much of our Latin Christian culture came from. Now, we call ourselves Roman Catholics, and we know that the Romans spoke Latin, so we assume that that's our background, that that's our spiritual heritage. But really, a lot of Latin culture from the 1st century, 2nd century, 3rd century came from North Africa. North Africa, at that time, Roman North Africa, was undergoing this literary renaissance, a cultural renaissance, a renaissance in all of the legal sciences and other sciences as well. So there was a great flourishing at that time, and the influence was running that way.
Right. Well, it's interesting, even just the simple idea of kind of thinking about the way we think about Africa as a continent, and in some ways we bifurcate it as well.
Yes.
We do tend to think of the North and the rest of the continent, and the Romans and the other people at that time did likewise. And so when they talked about Africa, they meant different things.
Well, they had different provinces in the larger landmass, the continent that we call Africa. So Egypt and the countries around it were, one Roman province based in Egypt, in Alexandria, and Roman Africa really was based in Carthage, and it includes what we now know as Morocco, Algeria, Libya.
Libya.
So those countries were a different world, really. Latin-speaking as opposed to the Greek-speaking Egypt.
Okay, I see. And then you also have, obviously, Ethiopia.
Yes, which was another world entirely.
Which is another world entirely.
Yeah.
So you say the first thing you have to know about this book, this is not a book about race. The Africa we're talking about is a land of all kinds of races, from dark-skinned Ethiopians to blonde Germanic barbarians. That's interesting to realize that. And we're interested in why they thought the way they did and why they looked the way they did was because of that situation, the way history happened.
Yeah, the ancients did not make racial distinctions the way we do.
That's really interesting the way you say it. It was a class thing, right?
Money is what gave you value, but they really did not value one race, one color over another. Augustine makes reference to this, and St. Augustine is the great African Christian writer, but he makes references in passing once. He said, he says he's a North African. He said, and the Ethiopians have darker skin than I do, and the Gauls, the French, have lighter skin than I do. But he just mentions this as a fact. It's not any kind of cultural valuation.
You say Africa is a flashpoint in our debates today. Many people will hear what they think a person like me would say. What do you mean?
Well, this book really came out of an article that I wrote about Africa and the early church, and in it, different people took me to task. All right, because some people said I had no right to write about Africa because I don't have any African ancestry. Now, I probably do because I'm Sicilian, and the Africans owned Sicily for a while. That's how the Romans got into the empire business, because they wanted Sicily back.
Well, you had Scipio Africanus, right? One of the great generals.
So people were writing that way because they think that race somehow, or ancestry, or cultural identity somehow equips you to write about history, and I don't think that's true.
Right.
I think that history should help us to transcend differences, We have to check our prejudices. We have to be aware of our prejudices. Right. So you undergo a certain examination of conscience whenever you write history, even a popular history like this. But I think that history really belongs to all of us.
Right. You say our Roman liturgy actually developed in North Africa. Some of our most important theological ideas developed in Egypt. And then there's a fascinating case, you say, of Ethiopia, a glorious Christian civilization that was cut off from most of the Christian world for a long, long time. And ultimately you say, and you quote, as the ancient Greeks and Romans used to say, always something new from Africa. What did they mean by that, do you think?
Well, Alexandria in Egypt was the intellectual capital of antiquity. It had the greatest library in antiquity. The kings there tried to get every book that had been written onto the shelves of their library. So it had this reputation as an intellectual center, and so much of the of theology, the reasoned reflection on Revelation began there. We find it happening with the Jews and great figures like Philo of Alexandria, but early on we find Christians like Pantaenus, who founded a school there, followed by Clement of Alexandria, who was erudite beyond belief, and he taught classes. We have his lecture notes, and they're amazing because he knew the sciences, he knew the arts, and he managed to incorporate all of these things into his Christian teaching. And then there's Origen, who really dominated biblical studies and invented critical biblical studies as we know them today. So all of these great figures of that time produced new things, out of their reflection on biblical revelation.
And you talk about you talk about Gaul, you talk about the Vandals, you talk about the Arian heresy being something that happened. Why were they attracted to the Arian heresy?
Well, I think that they were attracted to it because of Arius's packaging, really.
The songs or
the songs and the slogans, and the fact that rich people liked it.
Oh, okay.
All of these things together made it very attractive.
Okay.
Arius was kind of a genius at promotion, and he went from place to place, schmoozing with the muckety-mucks, and people saw that Arianism was attractive to them, those people, and I want to be like them. I want to be rich. So this Arianism became a ticket.
Especially as you indicated, the class was really the most important thing at the time in the Roman culture. You say, as we'll soon see, Roman Africa was already a complicated heap of tribes. Nations in ancient time has only grown more complicated since. Now you call it an upside-down view of Africa, and the idea that even in North Africa today, we usually think of it as being Arab.
Yeah.
Today.
Right. But that's after the Arab invasions, which came after the time of the Church Fathers. So it's a different cultural composition now than it was then. But it's interesting because so many of the peoples who were there even before the Romans, who spoke the Punic language, the Berber language, are still there today. And they're still using kind of the descendants of those languages, even today. So Africa was more complicated than it seemed at face value. It became a Roman colony after the Punic Wars, when it was crushed. The city of Carthage was crushed, and it was colonized by Latins. But those Latins were really influenced in time by the peoples who lived around them, and that, I think, is what led to the cultural flourishing, that Renaissance I was talking about earlier, that eventually led to a Christian flourishing and a Christian Renaissance, and a great influence on the European peoples.
So how did Christianity come to that Africa, let's say, to North Africa? Did that come naturally out of Palestine and Judea? Did it go up to Rome and then come down from Rome? How did it get there?
We don't know. Okay. And the truth is that in a lot of cities, we don't know how Christianity got there, but we know that it was fairly well developed by the year 170, when suddenly Christianity emerges in the historical record, the documentary record, the court records in North Africa. Because by that time, we have a large number of people, 12 people being tried. We have their court transcript.
Okay.
We have the interrogation, so we know certain things about them. We know that they were well organized. We know that they were well educated. They were people who had books. The church had already, by that time, been established enough to produce people like this, who appeared in the courtroom. So the beginnings are really shrouded in mist. But what we know is that by about the year 170, there is a Christian church there, and there is a real Christian intellectual life. In 190 AD, Tertullian is boasting that all of the trades, all of the fields of endeavor, every level of government had been infiltrated by Christians, and there were Christians very influential in all those places. So he said, he laughs and he says, "We've left you nothing but your temples." So by his time, 190, Christianity was that widespread.
Okay, and you also allude to the fact that thanks to the Roman military building their own interstate roadway, which, you know, the Appian Way, etc., places that still exist even today, I wish they built roads like the Romans did.
I know.
That it was also something that allowed Christianity to spread so quickly, right?
It really did. I think it was providential at that time, because you have Caesar Augustus in power, unifying the world for the first time, bringing world peace, suppressing the pirates on the high seas so that there's open travel from one place to another. And then right around the same time, a little bit before, a mariner discovers the trade winds so that you can travel on the high seas, you can get to your destination even faster. And what that means is that the gospel has clear roads to walk on, you know, and get to the far corners of the earth. It's an amazing thing that happened. I think it was God's providence.
You talk about the Donatist problem. Who were the Donatists and what was the problem? Why does that have to do with Africa?
It's a movement that arose in Africa around the time of the last great persecution, the persecution of Diocletian, which is something that happened on and off at first in the 290s, and then it really kind of heated up in the early 300s. And it was a ruthless persecution. It was a merciless persecution, and it was especially hot in Africa. And what we find is that some people caved in.
Right.
They offered the sacrifice to the gods. They paid homage to the emperor's genius, and they committed apostasy. Now you have a problem then. How do you receive these people back?
Right.
Especially when they're clergy and they've done this. Now the church's way was the way of mercy. The Catholic Church's way was the way of mercy. You know, you do penance, you come back. And they even allowed some of these bishops who committed apostasy to come back. The Donatists protested that. They said, hey, look, my wife and her husband, they died for the faith, and you're saying now this guy's going to hear their confession? No, it's not going to work that way. So they walked off. They did their own thing. And it became this rigorous party, and even a terrorist party that caused a lot of not only unrest in the church, but also civic unrest in North Africa. So it became a real problem for the first Christian emperors.
Now you have a chapter, you talk about the story of the Ethiopian eunuch who we hear about in Scripture. Besides the fact that he's from Ethiopia, why did you bring that up?
Well, because he's from Ethiopia, and that's an important point, because what we know then is that he was in Jerusalem for the feast days, right? So we have evidence of a Jewish presence in Ethiopia, and not only, you know, a presence among the rabble in Ethiopia, but a court official, someone who's working for the queen herself.
Right.
And he's faithful to a Jewish heritage and returning to Jerusalem for the holy days. That's a very important thing. And when you think about it, he had to go home at some point, and he took the gospel with him. So earlier I mentioned that in Carthage, we don't know when the church began. You know, this may be those hidden beginnings of the church in Ethiopia. We don't know what happened when he got home. We don't have any written record of what happened when that guy got back to Ethiopia. But we can be sure, if he got home, he told the gospel where he was.
Right. And he was in a position where people would care and
to
listen,
have some influence,
as you indicated,
right.
certainly in those cultures of that day.
Yes.
So what would you describe with the special characteristics of the African Christianity in those first centuries? What would be special characteristics?
There's this determined character and a disciplined character, and adherence to a very high level of morality. Now, this isn't universal, and people sin and people fall, and there's plenty of evidence of that. But there was an almost fanatical devotion to the standards of Christianity in North Africa. Many of the heresies and schisms that arose in Africa arose because of this determined quality to obey a high standard of morality and even demand heroism of Christian believers.
And it's interesting you bring that up because you make a distinction for people with the idea of schism versus heresy, and that had to do with the whole Donatist thing, right?
Oh yes, because they still held to the Articles of the Creed, same sacraments, but they were separated from the church. They were separated from communion because they refused to take sacraments from clergy who had committed apostasy.
Okay, very good. Africa and the early church, the almost forgotten roots of Catholic Christianity. Speaking of Africa, let's go to faith of the fathers. You always like the early church fathers.
I always have.
That's one of your personal likes there. First one, these are 4 different books. The first one I wanted to mention was on St. Augustine.
Yes.
So why is Augustine, we hear about Augustine a lot. Is he the most important one?
Well, he's one of the most important saints, certainly.
Period.
In history. And he's probably one of the handful most important intellectuals in all of history. He really laid the foundation, the intellectual foundation, for the culture that arose to take the place of Roman civilization when Rome fell and Europe fell into the Dark Ages. He's not a European, he's an African. But again, we have an instance of Africans setting the agenda for the future of the church worldwide. Augustine he invented new genres of writing, the autobiography and that sort of thing. If you study almost any kind of theology, he wrote some of the foundational texts, the Trinity, on morality, on scripture interpretation. So many different fields of theology, he wrote the foundational texts, at least in the Latin.
Is that what you mean by the term another kind of letter? If that's what he was writing, in a sense, those people, they're in a sense of an autobiography or a different approach. Now, also you say that he was not attempting to write an exemplary life, but to repent of his sins before God and offer in their place a different kind of confession, the confession of praise. What's a confession of praise?
Well, a confession means just to speak out loud, right? And his book is addressed to God. It's as if he's speaking out loud to God. He's addressing God in his book. He's not addressing you, dear reader. He's addressing the Lord throughout the book. And I think he wanted people to be able to put themselves in his shoes because he knew that his book would be read by sinners like him. And he wanted their conversion as he had converted. And his conversion was long and arduous over the course of 17 years of sin and separation.
Well, what do you say? People say sometime with St. Augustine, well, it's nice. He sold all his wild oats, had a good time, and then he decided to settle down. That must be a nice way to go about it. Is that an approach to a good spiritual life?
Well, no. When you read it, all the time he's there, he's seeking pleasure. He's really in an agony. He's in a spiritual agony because he knew this didn't correspond to the truth, and he was a seeker after truth. And he would go to one place and then another looking for truth, and he thought that these Manichaeans, these strange, New Agey kind of esoteric religions from the East were going to settle things for him. But the more he dug into them, the more he found they were wanting.
That's like a dualism kind of thing going on, right? Where what you do with your body doesn't really affect your spirituality.
But that didn't bring him happiness.
We hear a lot about, that's kind of a very popular idea of a lot of people today, too.
It keeps coming back.
Right, yeah, absolutely.
And this is, this is what we see in the life of Augustine. But his life was so much more than his confessions, because after that, he went back home to Africa. He became a bishop, and he became very influential in the church there. He became very influential in setting a model for how a bishop should work in the years that followed, the centuries that followed, because the bishops often ended up in the Dark Ages the most educated guys around.
Right.
That they provided as much government as you were going to get in some places.
Right. That's St. Augustine. Another faith of our fathers focus is St. Irenaeus, and he's famous for what particular thing?
Well, he's famous for his great work against the Gnostics.
Right. The heresies.
Against the heresies. So there were so many different kinds of heresy by the time he was alive. Right. He probably dictated or wrote out this work, and it seems almost freeform. He's saying what's on his mind, but he's engaging their works directly.
Right.
So he's quoting from them directly, and he's addressing their arguments. So we can look at it really as the first work of almost systematic theology. He wants to.
The original Catholic answers, basically.
That's it.
Right.
That's right. That's a good analogy.
Okay.
And they have a good patron in him, I'm sure. So.
Right. Or radio replies, if you go back even further. Right. As one memorable example, Hans von Balthasar goes as far to call him the founding father of theology itself.
Yes, because he's giving a reasoned reflection on divine revelation. So he's responding to these people who are rising up within the church.
Right.
They're in error, but they're rising up from within the church, and then they become a parasite on the church.
Right.
Because really what they didn't evangelize. They didn't go out and try to convert the pagans to Christ. What they did was they tried to woo Orthodox believers away to their kind of Christianity by trying to sell them something, really. And often it was literally selling them something. You know, you pay us enough money, we tell you the passwords to get past the archons when you die.
Right. It's their versions of bizarre indulgences or something,
Yes.
I guess. You know, Irenaeus loves his enemies even as he unsparingly dispatches with his arguments and errors, that he actually loved the Gnostics.
He did. And as a matter of fact, we have a letter he wrote to one of his childhood friends who had become a Gnostic teacher. And it's full of affection, and he draws on their common past, and he tries to revive the memory of that for this guy so they can remember, he can remember that they had sat together at the foot of Polycarp, who had sat at the foot of St. John the Apostle.
Right.
They were that close to the apostles. And he wanted to bring his friend back to that example of Polycarp and the doctrine that he taught. And he did it very effectively. I think he had not only love for them in an abstract sense, but genuine affection for them.
You say Against the Heresies, that title. Not only do these books contain, books 1 and 2, a number of hidden treasures related to early Christian orthodoxy, but the reader will find in Irenaeus' descriptions of the Gnostic many parallels with contemporary errors, as we alluded to before, that can be held by our neighbors, our friends, and even ourselves today.
I think that's why Pope Francis made him a doctor of the church. It was a very controversial move. He's been dead a long time. You know, why this sudden interest in him? But I think Pope Francis sees his importance for the day, the time we're living in now, because so many of the errors that are spreading so rapidly, the error of transgenderism, for example, these are Gnostic errors. Okay, that require us to accept this doctrine of a body-spirit dualism.
Right, yeah, the ghost in the machine kind of thing, right? That's St. Irenaeus. And there's St. Athanasius. What's different about him?
Oh man, what a great figure. He's a figure of defiance, right? He's a figure of boldness, of a certain intransigence, a holy intransigence. You know, there's the phrase that Constantius suggested to us, Athanasius against the world. Now, the Emperor Constantius was mocking him by saying, no one agrees with you, guy. You know, no one agrees with you. It's you against the world here. And Athanasius gloried in that because he was going to stand against the world if the world was wrong. And he saw that the world was wrong about something very important, which is the doctrine of the Trinity, the doctrine of the Incarnation. And if you get those two things wrong, you'll get everything else wrong. And everybody else is saying this is just an abstraction, it's just esoteric teaching, that kind of thing. Just go along to get along. And he wouldn't just go along to get along. So he was bishop for 45 years. He spent 17 years of his time as bishop in exile, deposed in distant lands where he didn't know the language. So he really did suffer for the faith, but he triumphed. You know, because it was his, well, not his, it was the apostles' doctrine that prevailed over the great threat of Arianism. Right,
because if Jesus isn't the Son of God, then there is no Trinity, right?
There is no salvation as we know salvation.
Period. Yeah. And also he talks about the doctrines of the Trinity, incarnation, and what makes Athanasius who he is. You talk about the fact that these dead dogmas that he stood up for, that people are like, well, they don't really matter anymore.
Right.
And he stood up against the world because they do matter.
And we've always got to do that. So we always have a model in Athanasius. You know, we don't have to be the kind of intellectual he was, but we should have as intelligent a faith as we can. Study should be part of our development. That's what he teaches us, really.
Now, let's close off with St. John Chrysostom from Fathers of the Faith. And he was a famous preacher, right?
He was. As a matter of fact, his name, Chrysostom, is really just a nickname, and it means golden mouth.
Really?
Yeah,
okay. Golden
mouth. So he got that nickname from the quality of his preaching, and he's probably the Christian most famous for preaching in all of history.
Is that why he had so many adversaries and enemies?
You better believe it. Also because he had no filter.
Okay.
So he didn't hold back from preaching, and sometimes the empress was sitting there in his congregation, and she heard him preaching against some of her favorite pastimes, like wearing a lot of makeup, like having an image of you placed in the town square and that kind of thing. And he would preach against vanity, and she took it personally.
Yeah, you say he rattled a lot of cages.
He did.
Stuff like that.
He
Okay,
did.
very good. That's Faith of the Fathers, all 4 books there. Mike, and also Africa and the Early Church, Almost Forgotten Roots of Catholic Christianity. Plenty for people to dive into. Appreciate you stopping by EWTN's Bookmark. All these books are available through the EWTN Religious Catalog, EWTNRC.com for all things Catholic. I'm Doug Keck. Thanks for joining us here on Bookmark. We'll see you next time.